Armenians and Azeris originated in areas around the southern Caucasus, while Azeris mostly settled around the area of the Caspian Sea and flat plateaus further inland. Armenians settled in the mountainous regions. A considerable degree of hostility always existed between the people, which largely stems from racial, religious, cultural, and societal differences. The Islamic Azeris have close ethnic and religious ties to the Turks. Christian Armenia is more on par with the Orthodox Russians. The borders have never really been defined, or existing treaties were often challenged, which is perhaps the main reason for the war around Nagorno-Karabakh, a mountainous enclave in Azeri territory. It has been populated by Armenians. Conflicts not only between the two nations, but all over the diverse southern Caucasus, have been going on for centuries, where peace would alternate with war every couple of decades. The first fight started in 1918 and lasted for 2 years, after Armenia and Azerbaijan declared their independence from Russia, following the decline of the Russian Tsarist Empire. Unfortunately, they couldn't find an agreement on the border, which would soon lead to the Armenian-Azerbaijani War from 1918 to 1920. The war was characterized by outbreaks of massacres and ethnic cleansing on both sides. The conflict only ended after the Soviets invaded and occupied both republics. The underlying causes were never really settled. To make it even worse, the Soviets placed Karabakh under Azerbaijani administration, so it was just a question of time until the ethnic conflict would come back to light. Armenian discontent began to be voiced as early as 1963. Armenians complained that their cultural and national rights were continually trampled upon by the Soviet Azerbaijani authorities in Baku. The administration had also attempted to Azerify the region by encouraging Armenians to leave and thus change the ethnic demography. But the complaints were never really heard, so Armenians would eventually take matters into their own hands. After the dissolution of the Soviet republics, the two nations would reignite the unsettled conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh, again almost the day that the UdSSR started to dissolve. In February 1988, Armenians began protesting in Yerevan with a demand for unification. 3 weeks later, the leaders of Karabakh voted in favor of unifying the autonomous region with Armenia, and thus pushed back against the Azerbaijani agenda. A series of violent pogroms on both sides caused a mass flight into their home countries, while at the same time assault rifles, RPGs, and ammunition from Soviet caches mysteriously disappeared. While the first 3 years were conflicts just between volunteers and militias, Operation Ring would change that. It was the first major governmental action by Azerbaijan and Soviet officials to displace Armenians from Shah-Yaman province in northern Karabakh. Human rights organizations documented a wide number of violations and abuses committed by Soviet and Azerbaijani forces. These included forced deportations of civilians, unlawful killings, and the seizure or destruction of property. Approximately 17,000 Armenians living in 23 of Shah-Yaman's villages were deported out of the region. Despite fierce protests on the Armenian side, no measures were taken. The perpetrators would go unpunished. In the end, the operation proved counterproductive, with the violence only reinforcing the belief among Armenians that armed resistance remained the only solution to the conflict. The initial resistance inspired volunteers to start forming irregular volunteer detachments. The dissolution of the Soviet Union only fueled the conflict, since suddenly all the Soviet guns fell in the hands of the conflicting parties. The once sporadic battles between Armenians and Azeris intensified after Operation Ring. War was inevitable. In Soviet doctrine, it was assumed that Armenia would become a battlefield if NATO troops would invade from Turkey. Therefore, the majority of weapons would be stored in Azerbaijan, which left the Armenians at a disadvantage. But the Azerbaijanis were in the pitiful situation to assault an irregular opponent in a mountainous region. Armenia and Karabakh had 40,000 men under arms, Azerbaijan about 42,000. Most men had served in the Soviet army. Some even had deployments in Afghanistan, but most Azerbaijanis were often subject to discrimination during their service in the Soviet military and relegated to work in construction battalions rather than fighting corps. The lack of such military experience was one factor that left Azerbaijan relatively unprepared for the war. Armenia fielded about 180 artillery pieces, 170 tanks, 360 APCs, 200 armored fighting vehicles, 3 aircraft and 13 helicopters. Azerbaijan had at least 2 to 4 times the available material. Azerbaijan also blockaded railroad lines and the delivery of oil and natural gas to Armenia and the Autonomous Republic of Artsakh since 1989. The blockade shattered the Armenian economy, sparked social unrest and created a devastating humanitarian crisis. It was in these conditions that Azerbaijan subjected Stepanaker to shelling and bombardment. In November 1991, Azerbaijani forces took Shusha. Shusha lay on a mountaintop in its vicinity of Stepanaker. It was from that mountaintop where artillery fire was directed into the capital city with its 50,000 people, who were subject to daily random bombardment. The fighting and shelling had driven away nearly 20,000 of Stepanaker's residents and forced the remainder to live in underground basements. The indiscriminate shelling, sniper shooting and aerial attacks killed or maimed hundreds of civilians and destroyed homes, hospitals and other buildings that were not legitimate military targets, and generally terrorized the civilian population. Trapped inside the city with nowhere to go, all they could do was to wait for a miracle, and their prayers shouldn't go unanswered. Shusha favored the defenders in any way. It was on high ground and the manpower as well as the equipment favored the Azerbaijanis. But it was still in the mountainous Karabakh territory and therefore hard to supply, let alone to reinforce. In the twilight hours of the 8th of May 1992, the Armenians invaded the town. In a fierce firefight, the Armenian decisiveness proved to be futile. By the next day, the town was captured at the cost of hundreds of casualties. To top it all off, the Legacies corridor, the only route between Armenia and Karabakh, was captured by Armenia. The region now could be supplied again through the land corridor. The siege was lifted after 7 painful months of daily shelling, but the war was far from over. Armenia was still under economic blockade. Winter during the years of war was especially cold, as many families throughout Armenia and Karabakh were left without heating and hot water. Grain had become difficult to procure. The Armenian diaspora raised money and donated supplies to their people. Displaced Azerbaijanis had not necessarily a better destiny. Most of them had to live in makeshift camps provided by Iran and Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan renewed an offensive in June. During Operation Goran Boy, the army marched through the northern and eastern territory of Karabakh, which was largely understaffed. On July 4, 1992, after a long siege, Azerbaijani forces captured the largest town in the region, Matakert, also known as Agdara. By this time, Azerbaijan had captured about 50% of the territory. After the reorganization of militias, the Azerbaijani advance was stopped. By September to December 1992, Azerbaijan's army was exhausted and suffered heavy losses. Faced with an imminent defeat, the Azeris moved what was left of their army out of Martuni and back to Ganja, where it could be recuperated and restocked. As winter approached, both sides abstained from fighting. As the summer of 1993 approached, Armenia received massive shipments from Russia. Armenian forces launched a new round of attacks that overran villages in Northern Karabakh that had been held by the Azeris since the previous year. The political fallout from the ongoing defeats reached the leadership in Baku, which, frustrated by the news, started infighting. The Armenian side took advantage of the turmoil in Baku, which had left the Karabakh front almost undefended. The following 4 months of political instability in Azerbaijan led to the loss of control of over 5 districts, as well as the north of Nagorno-Karabakh. Azerbaijani military forces were unable to put much resistance in the face of Armenian advances and abandoned most of their positions with little resistance. In late June 1993, they were driven out from Matakert, losing their final foothold in the enclave. By July, Armenian forces were seen preparing an attack and capture Agdam, another district that fell outside of Nagorno-Karabakh, with the aim of widening a cordon that would keep towns and villages in their positions out of range of Azerbaijani artillery. By early September, Azerbaijani forces were in a state of complete disarray. Many of the heavy weapons that they had received and bought from the Russians were either taken out of action or abandoned during battle. Since the June 1992 offensive, Armenian forces had captured dozens of tanks, light armor and artillery from Azerbaijan. In the wake of the Armenian offensive, Turkey demanded a withdrawal. Thousands of Turkish troops were sent to the common border. The Russian garrison in Armenia, in turn, likewise mobilized and prepared for a further escalation. To bolster the rank of its army, the Armenian government issued a decree that instituted a 3-month call-up for men of up to age 45 and resorted to brass gang raids to enlist recruits. Azerbaijan's offensive grew more and more desperate as boys as young as 16 were thrown into action, with little to no training. The Azeris also recruited militias from Afghanistan, Chechnya and volunteers from Turkey to bolster their numbers, but the lack of commitment and the subsequent demoralization was never really addressed, and would be the straw that broke the camel's back. A reporter famously remarked, "For Azerbaijan, the issue of Karabakh is a matter of ambition. For the Armenians of Karabakh, it is a matter of life or death." January 1944 saw renewed offensives from Azerbaijani forces and Afghan mercenaries, who recaptured part of the Fuzuli district, including the railway junction of Horadiz on the Iranian border, but failed to recapture the town of Fuzuli itself. On January the 10th, an offensive was launched by Azerbaijan towards the region of Markadert. The offensive managed to advance and take back several parts of Karabakh in the north and to the south, but soon petered out. This status quo would take place on the negotiation table. Armenia would make significant territorial gains. After 6 years of intense fighting, both sides returned to the negotiation table. Azerbaijan, with its manpower exhausted and aware that Armenian forces had an unimpeded path to Baku, counted on a new ceasefire. All parties agreed to cease hostilities and vote to observe a ceasefire that would go into effect on the 12th of May 1994. Casualties are only estimated and believed to be somewhere between 5,000 to 6,000 for Armenia and 12,000 for the Azeris. Both sides roughly suffered 30,000 wounded as well. Armenia had a population of about 3 million in 1989, Azerbaijan about 7 million. A diaspora of about 400,000 Armenians left Azerbaijan, and 724,000 Azeris left Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia. As neither side signed military international conventions, instances of ill discipline and atrocities were rife. I spare you some of the details, but looting and collecting trophies from the dead were among the harmless cases. Azerbaijan lost a considerable amount of its territory during the war and was literally humiliated. The sheer incompetence of leadership turned the nation to a post-Soviet laughingstock. But to Azerbaijan's credit, they tried to negotiate a peace treaty in 1997. The only obstacle was the ignorance of the Karabakh leadership, who thought that they could get more. With that attitude, of course, they doomed their country and sabotaged all peace talks. So I guess it comes as a surprise when I tell you that this conflict was far from over. In fact, the cycle would repeat itself again. Alright guys, that's it for today. If you have something interesting to share, then let me know in the comments. Or did I forget something, then let me know as well. If you want to support this channel, then leave a like or maybe a sub if you think that I've earned it. That's it for today, and I hope you see you next time. Bye.